Can you breathe with me? Breathe with me just a moment. In. There is no audio coming through today, but if you recall the scene from Return of the Kings, the third movie of the Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is talking about Sauron's greatest threat, the Witch King of Angmar, and how he leads his armies out of Mordor to attack the world of men and elves and dwarves. You don't have to be a lover of fantasy to understand the weight of this moment. Frodo carries the One Ring that Sauron will use to subjugate all the world under his power. And Sam is there by his side. But this great fear, watching a great host exit the land of Mordor, strikes fear in the heart of all. It doesn't take anything to know what fear feels like. This was my world in 2000. You can stop the clip. The year I received an HIV diagnosis that felt like a death sentence. Can you bring the mic down just a little bit? The year fear became my constant companion. In those days, the medications were expected to eventually fail. I was 25 years old, and I believed I was dying. Not someday, soon. And I believed I deserved it. In those days, the shame was suffocating. Can you bring the mic up just a little? Test, test, test. I had known better and still chosen poorly. I might have unknowingly passed it to others before I knew. I carried the weight of every disappointed look, every careful conversation with family, who now expected their son, their brother, to die any day. I walked alone for years because how could I ask anyone to start a relationship with someone who was about to die? Who could I burden with loving someone the world saw as diseased, dangerous, damaged? This is fear as destroyer, fear as isolation, fear that says, you are alone, you are doomed, there is no help coming. But wait, there's another story. Here Gandalf is asking Pippin. And Pippin is asking, is there any hope for Frodo and Sam? And he tells him it's a fool's hope, if any. And then he sends him on a special mission. he tells him that one of the Shire folk are being called on yet once again to do something for the rest of the world. He sends him up to the tower holding a beacon, a stack of wood that he's asking Pippin to light. This fire, this climb, is the moment that Pippin finds his purpose. With shaking hands, he lights his beacon. And then somewhere across in the distance, we find others who were watching. The beacon is lit. A moment where someone across on a mountain top is watching, waiting for the signal to light their beacon. This is much better with music. Can you imagine? You're stuck on a post up on a mountaintop for decades, and now your beacon is lit, and now you get to light yours. And another is lit. As across the mountains, over the clouds, a signal is passed along. For someone who's waiting. Waiting for the call. The call for Gondor to ask for aid. And Theoden King, the king of Rohan, while all look to him for his leadership, he says, and Rohan will answer. Muster the Rohirrim. Thank you, you can stop the clip. Something happened in those years of darkness. Slowly, quietly, I began to connect. Not despite my diagnosis, but because, and through it, I made music. I gave love to my stepchildren. I cared for family and friends, and eventually this congregation. And the strangest thing began to happen. I didn't die. I kept living. And the more I connected with others, the more courage began to blossom. Not the absence of fear, but courage that could hold fear and love in the same breath. This is fear transformed into connection. Fear that becomes signal, terror that becomes invitation. 25 years later, I'm not just alive, I'm awake and alive because of what fear taught me. About the true nature of courage and where it grows. About presence as the only time when possibilities open. About how isolation turns fear into poison, but connection turns fear into medicine. The neuroscience is actually quite clear on this. When our amygdala, that alarm system in our brain, detects threat, it floods our system with stress hormones. We have only 3 primary responses: fight, flight, or freeze. But here's what's fascinating. Whether fear becomes paralyzing or mobilizing depends largely on one factor: connection. When we face fear alone, isolated, our nervous system defaults to primitive survival mode. But when we face fear with trusted relationships, something remarkable happens. Our social engagement system can actually co-regulate our fear response. The presence of trusted others literally changes our brain chemistry, shifting us from reactive survival to conscious choice. What I didn't know in 2000 was that my diagnosis would become the signal for the single greatest transformation of my life. Not because the fear went away, but because I learned to let others answer when I finally found the courage to call for aid. Let's spiral through the 7 threads of the spiral of becoming honestly, courageously, with stories, questions, and the wisdom of our UU tradition that says growth is not optional. But growth through fear is always a choice. We begin with the first thread, the primacy of presence with fear. It says, what we avoid grows in the dark. What we face transforms in the light. Science teaches us something profound about fear and presence. When we avoid or suppress fear, our amygdala actually becomes more reactive over time, like a smoke alarm that gets more sensitive the longer you ignore it. But when we practice presence with fear, when we literally stay with the bodily sensations without feeling, something remarkable happens in our nervous system. The prefrontal cortex, our center for conscious choice, comes back online. Reverend Thandeka, which means beloved in Xhosa, reminds us that the ultimate religious question is not what do you believe, but what do you fear? She sees the traditional religious emphasis on a set of intellectual beliefs as limited and potentially spiritually stifling. She suggests that focusing on what people think they believe can obscure the deeper, more primal emotional drivers of their spiritual lives. Her work, which is grounded in affective neuroscience, posits that the capacity for emotional connection is the true access point to a spiritual awakening. For her, it is through an experience of deep feeling, not intellectual assent, that people are transformed. This is the difference between Mordor's darkness and Gondor's beacon. Mordor represents fear that consumes, fear that isolates, that spreads like infection, that destroys connection. But the beacon of Gondor, that's fear transformed into signal, into call, into invitation for help. Fear becomes teacher when we stop running. Fear becomes beacon when we stop hiding. When I first named my deepest fear that an HIV diagnosis meant I was fundamentally unlovable, untouchable, that I would die alone, I thought speaking it might make it real. Instead, speaking it made it more beacon, a call for aid that others could actually answer. And slowly I began to discover I wasn't as alone as I believed. Presence with fear weaves into the next thread. Consent as sacred boundary. It instructs us, no transformation may be forced, even by fear itself. Growth isn't conquest, it's conversation. To grow through fear is not to eliminate it, it is to choose our relationship with it, consciously over time. It's what our fourth principle calls the free and responsible search. Not just a right, but a sacred practice of choosing our own edges. This congregation didn't try to talk me out of my fears. They asked a different question. What is this fear trying to protect? They let me discover that fear of abandonment was actually love in armor. They didn't rush me to heal. They invited me to explore. What is your fear protecting? What would it mean to thank your fear before asking it to transform? Are you honoring your own pace of becoming or forcing yourself to grow at someone else's timeline? The third thread, memory without prison, cries out, we are not trapped by what once frightened us. Growth through fear means rewriting the story of what fear means. Releasing the inherited narrative that fear equals weakness, failure, sin. And it means choosing what courage to carry forward. So much of my relationship with fear was shaped by messages I'd inherited. Good people don't get scared. If you had enough faith, you wouldn't worry. Fear is the opposite of trust. At UUFBR, I learned something revolutionary, that fear is often love wearing a disguise. Anxiety can be the signal that something sacred is asking to be born. And I began to rewrite the relationship. As Reverend Julianne Jamaica Soto says, we are called to transform the stories that no longer serve us. Reverend Soto writes extensively about personal identity and resilience, encouraging individuals, especially those in marginalized communities, to claim their own stories and embrace their authentic selves. Soto, a transgender minister, recognizes that cultural stories of oppression and marginalization do not serve us. They have been active in seeking racial wholeness and working against racism within their faith and beyond. And in that rewriting, we spiral toward wisdom. What old story about fear are you ready to release? What new relationship with your fear wants to emerge? Who are you helping to rewrite their story of courage? In the middle of the spiral, we thread number 4, the sacred pause before the leap. Like a breath held at the edge of a diving board, the most courageous act is often to wait until readiness ripens. Growth through fear is not always about acting. Sometimes it's stillness. Sometimes the most radical act is to pause, to breathe with the fear, to let the wisdom emerge before leaping. This is not cowardice. It's the sacred pause that leads and lets courage ripen. Those years after my diagnosis felt like an endless pause. Not the sacred kind, the terrifying kind. Every day was waiting for symptoms, waiting for the medication to fail, switching to new medications, waiting to die. But in other spaces, my stillness was labeled as giving up. But here, slowly, I learned it could be honored as preparation. No one pushed me toward false hope. They sat with me in the uncertainty until I could feel that presence itself was a form of resistance. They let my courage ripen in its own time. Where in your life are you rushing toward change that might actually be calling for patient cultivation? The fifth thread pulses through your nervous system, embodied courage. It whispers. The body knows before the mind. Fear lives in flesh, and so does bravery. Here's what's fascinating about the neuroscience of courage. Bravery isn't the absence of the fear response. It's the presence of connection alongside the fear response. When our nervous system is in healthy relationship with others, we can literally feel afraid and safe at the same time. Why do herds of caribou do this? Our heart might race, our hands might shake, but our deeper nervous system knows, I am not alone in this. The stress hormone cortisol, which floods our system during fear, actually decreases when we're in the presence of trusted others. Oxytocin and dopamine increase. We move from survival mode to connection mode. Growth through fear isn't theoretical. It's not a mental exercise. It's not transcending the messiness. It's trembling hands that light the beacon anyway. It's the racing heart that calls for aid. It's the sacred permission to be afraid and still connected. Think about that moment when Pippin climbs the tower. His hands are shaking, he's terrified, but he lights the beacon, not because he's unafraid. He lights it because he's afraid and knows they need help. Risma Menakem reminds us, trauma is not stored in your thoughts, it's stored in the body, but so is resilience. Menakem challenges the common notion that trauma can be healed through conversation and cognitive understanding alone. He stresses that because the trauma is physically stored in the body, effective healing must engage the body directly. This is how it happens. We face the naked truth of our mortality, our vulnerability, and our aching need for connection, and find we cannot accept it. The tragedy isn't the years lost in self-doubt. It's that we carry our transformations as trauma rather than triumph. That transformation is real, but memory is unreliable. It tells us that we survived by accident rather than by courage, telling us that what was growth was actually our punishment. And so, like the orcs of Mordor, once noble but twisted, we now say that we need our monsters to carry the shame of truths we can't bear. We need our monsters to carry the shame of truths we can't bear. In them, we plant the seed of our own becoming. But we experience it, sadly, as something done to us instead of something chosen by us. For years, I didn't know how to inhabit a body I thought was dying. I carried HIV like a secret shame written in my cells. But this community never treated my body as contaminated or dangerous. They showed me that courage could be felt, not just performed. They taught me that hands that shake from fear can still reach out in connection. They showed me that a body carrying a virus could still be a body capable of love. And slowly, I let myself be brave in my own skin, not just as someone who thought about courage, but as someone who felt their way toward wholeness, virus and all. Your body knows fears your mind won't acknowledge. So we take a pill. That is one therapy that is valid and helps people get through their lives. But what is it trying to tell you about what wants to grow? In the midst of embodied knowing, the sixth thread weaves a more challenging mystery. Reverent uncertainty about outcomes. It calls from the unknown. We cannot grow and stay the same. The outcome of courage is always a surprise. Growth through fear is not knowing how this story ends. It's trusting the process even when you can't see the destination. It's befriending uncertainty as a co-creator of your transformation. As Reverend Rebecca Parker reminds us, faith is not the belief that everything will turn out fine. Faith is the conviction that whatever happens, we can meet it with love. She served for 25 years as the president of Star King School for the Ministry, where she trained a new generation of progressive ministers and activists. Her theological work includes a feminist critique of violence and redemptive suffering in Christianity, most notably in her co-authored book with Rita Nakashima Brock, Proverbs of Ashes. Parker's writing and ministry center on creating life-giving theologies and justice-making religious communities like this one, even amid trauma and anguish. There was no guarantee that facing my fears would make life easier. In fact, it made some things harder, but it made everything more real. UUFBR didn't promise me that courage would solve everything. They promised to walk with me through whatever emerged. Like courage entwined with mystery, it weaves us into the seventh and final thread, the spiral of becoming through fear. We end by beginning again, whispering, every fear faced becomes compost for the next growth. This is the heart of the spiral through fear. Growth is not a destination. It's the invitation to return again and again to the edge of what we know, not as some frightened self, but as someone wiser, braver, a little more whole. The core of engaging fear for growth is this profound truth that hope is not optimism. Hope is not positive thinking. Hope is the deep knowledge that we do not face our fears alone. When Pippin lights Gondor's beacon, it's not because he believes everything will work out fine. It's because Gandalf trusts that someone across those mountains, there are people who love them and are watching for their signal. And when Rohan sees that light, they don't hesitate. They don't calculate odds. They simply say, "We will answer." The Fellowship never promised me that my diagnosis would disappear. They never promised that love would be easy or that stigma would vanish. They promised something more powerful. They promised to watch for my beacon. They promised to answer when I called. They said it with presence, with witness, with endless willingness to see me as more than my diagnosis. And so I say, and I stay, because if they could turn my deepest shame into a signal others could answer, then maybe together we can teach the next terrified soul that their fear is not evidence of being broken, but evidence that they care about something sacred enough to risk everything for it. I say this clearly. We did not spiral to growth by being fearless or perfect or even ready. We spiraled here by being afraid together, by learning that isolation turns fear into poison, but connection turns fear into medicine. By discovering that the very thing that threatens to destroy us can become the thing that calls our people home. 25 years later, after a diagnosis I thought would end my story, I know this. I am alive, not because the fear went away, but because I learned where courage grows. It grows in connection. It grows in presence. It grows in the sacred willingness to let our fears become beacons that call our people home. And sometimes we did break open. But the spiral, it never said we had to face our fears alone. It said, light your beacon, call for aid, trust that love is watching for your signal. That's the growth I'm speaking of today. Not elimination of fear, not spiritual bypassing, but the sacred discovery that our fears can become bridges to each other when we're brave enough to let them be seen, when we trust enough to let them be answered. So every time I spiral back to that diagnosis and all it taught me, I ask myself, what beacon am I still afraid to light? Who am I still afraid to call? What if my deepest shame could become the greatest gift to someone else waiting in similar darkness? Because the beacons are always lit, beloved. The question is, are we watching for others' signals? Are we ready to answer when the call comes? So no, this is not a sermon about conquering fear. It's a confession of transformation. A breath held for 25 years and finally released. a beacon lit, not to lead you away from fear, but to say, come spiral through fear with me. Not because I'm unafraid, but because I've learned that fear and love are often the same energy wearing different masks. Not because I know what will happen, but because I trust that something sacred wants to emerge through our courage to be seen. We spiral, not because we've mastered fear, but because we've learned to let our deepest shame become our greatest beacon. Article 2 calls us to transform and grow spiritually and ethically. But not safely, not predictably, not as ongoing, but as ongoing courage. This is not individual bravery. This is shared courage, the kind that deepens when we spiral through fear together. This week, don't avoid what scares you. Spiral toward it. Look it in the eye and ask what it's trying to teach you. Ask yourself, what fear is actually my growth in disguise? What would I do if I trusted my fear and my courage could be partners? Say aloud with me, fear is not my enemy.
Fear is not my enemy.
It is my teacher wearing a frightening mask. Growth is not comfort. It's the spiral through discomfort toward wholeness. Let us not flee our fears. Let us spiral through them. Let us return, not as people who are no longer afraid, but as people who know how to be afraid and brave at the same time. Blessed be. May it be so. Let it spiral.